Showtime! The Capital G show starts right now.
What's up YouTube, Capital G here, doing another episode of Boomer Buzz. People seem to really enjoy this segment and I enjoy doing it, so I decided I would talk about what is infinitely, by a mile, in my opinion, the most interesting and intriguing deck in the metagame right now, and that is Volcanics. Now, for a quick history lesson, especially for you newer players, Volcanics are not anything new. This deck is as old as dirt. Well, the entire archetype is. And, I mean, people don't even realize this is a GX archetype. I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, we're talking 2006, 2007-ish. These cards are not new by any stretch of the imagination. You know, there are no Volcanic Synchros. There are no Volcanic Exceeds or Pendulums. They kind of just have to work with what they have. And I don't think that I've ever seen a situation like this in my entire life, where one card was released for an archetype kind of randomly, and it took the archetype to a whole new level. I mean, this archetype has been, for the most part, completely forgotten about and maligned. I mean, if you would have asked people their opinions on Volcanics, oh, maybe 3 months ago, they'd have been like, are you dumb? I mean, Volcanics, who the fuck plays that? I mean, people would have looked at you like you said Cloudians or some other archetype that really never took off. And while Volcanics did have some success in their heyday, and it wasn't great success, I'm talking, I think they topped 8'd two Shonen Jumps. It was mainly off the back of Volcanic Rocket being one of the better Stratos clones in the game. I mean, when you look at Stratos type cards, pretty much, you know, monsters that you normal summon them, they have the trigger effect and they add things. Most of them don't have 1900 attack, especially not in today's game, where things like Altair, they've been kind of shrunk down to like 1500 and less. Volcanic is kind of like a man among men. This dude can definitely beat some freaking ass, and you know, it was cool. The problem was the cards that he searched back then, Accelerator and Tri-Blaze, just weren't that good. You know, yes, one could blow up a monster and one did a very small amount of burn damage, which was practically never relevant. The biggest Achilles heel to these cards was the fact that you couldn't attack during your turn that you used them, which, I mean, let's just be honest. Ain't nobody got time for that shit. Like, if I pop your monster and I now have a clear board, I want to get it in. I want to get it in with my Rocket and my other guys. I want to be able to attack you. And those cards just kind of hindered what the deck wanted to do. It made pushing for big damage really, really hard to do. Now, enter this card, Blaze Accelerator Reload. Oh my God. I could not think, or I didn't think it was possible for Konami to make a card better designed than this. I mean, for starters, Reload works on both players' turns, and this is huge because it means you get way more utility out of this card than you ever would the Odin accelerators, the bad ones. You know, when you have some built-in cute effects, it can be kind of nice until your opponent realizes, wait a minute, I don't even have to worry about those effects because you can only use them during your turn, so I can pretty much do whatever the hell I want during my turn and not have to worry about them. Secondly, Blaze Accelerator Reload gives the deck speed and stability at the same time. And it's like, if you look at older archetypes, you know, or just newer archetypes that are slow, what do newer archetypes always want? They want speed. They want ways to, you know, get to their combo pieces. That's why so many anti-meta decks have always been playing Pot Duality, because they're looking for a way to mitigate the fact that they're slow. Or you have decks that will try and slow your opponent down, playing things like Skill Drain and Vanity's Emptiness and Royal Oppression back in the day, because they're trying to slow down the fast decks to their pace. This card basically does all of that, and it fixes the stability problem that the deck had in the past. It used to be, if you open with a bunch of Volcanics and you didn't have a way to get them out of your hand, I mean, you just had to deal with it or just get wrecked. And Phoenix from Wind Blast was pretty much the only good outlet in the past. And now you have ways to not only get those cards out of your hand, but draw at the same time, and it gives the deck more consistency. I'm talking about this card especially. This card was hella inconsistent in the past because it was like, how am I supposed to get 4 Pyros in the graveyard? You know, there weren't really a ton of ways other than having like the perfect setup. Now the perfect setup is pretty much every single turn for this deck. I mean, you see Royal Firestorm Guards be summoned, and it's hardly ever nowadays that you see this card not resolve its effect, which actually leads me to my next point. This deck has more draw power than any deck in the game right now, which is insane because it's an anti-meta deck. I mean, you talk about this, that kind of starts everything. The fact that you get to draw one every single turn. You throw on this guy who used to be very inconsistent, but now is very, very consistent. And then you add Magic Planter. You know, Magic Planter is the card that kind of ties everything together because it lets you potentially get rid of used up Phoenix Chains or reload and draw cards off of them. And just actually to go back to reload, I love that Konami adjusted this card to power creep. We know that Spell and Trap Destruction is everywhere, and face-up cards just don't last very long. I mean, if you are able to keep a card like Vanity's Emptiness on the field for multiple turns or Snatch Steal, then, I mean, more power to you, but face-up, continuous traps or spells don't really last that long because we have so much spell or trap removal in the game. And Konami was smart. They said, okay, well, if your Blaze Accelerator reload gets destroyed, well, you can activate it from the graveyard. I mean, how awesome is that? Now, let's talk about for a second why this deck has been so successful over the last couple of weeks and why it's a really good choice right now. So if you look at Volcanics and how they're currently built, and then you compare them to anti-meta and stun decks of the past, I mean, there is definitely a constant. And that's the fact that you want to constrict what your opponent wants to do the most. You want to constrict what your opponent likes to do. And usually that's done using Floodgate cards. Hello, Vanity's Emptiness. In the past, this may be a Floodgate like Skill Drain or Royal Oppression, but for the most part, that's a constant in anti-meta decks. And it basically says, okay, so Stellar Knights and Burning Abyss, we understand that you want to special summon a lot. Well, we're not having any of that shit. So yeah, your deck is going to be completely hindered by one card. And from there, once you have your one constriction card, you just get a decent sized beater, hello, Volcanic Rocket, and you beat the crap out of your opponent because your opponent doesn't have access to their boss monsters, because generally your Floodgate card will stop that, it will stop them from getting that. You know, if your opponent wants to somehow get Trevor on board, but you have Skill Drain, well, guess what? Trevor's just a vanilla card now, so he doesn't do anything. And if you have Royal Oppression or Vanity's Emptiness, they can't even get to that card. Now, the difference between this deck and anti-meta decks of the past is this deck has a certain element. It's almost like a trick that no one can account for. And it's, I mean, you can apply this to any format at any time ever. I don't care when you started playing this game, if it was Zeal 5D's era, if it was all the way back in the original Yu-Gi-Oh era. The fact that this deck can do serious burn damage, and it can do it multiple times, and it can do it in various ways, and it can do it consistently. You know, it used to be that to do burn damage, you had to commit to a burn deck. And once people had ways of stopping your burn cards, you didn't have a backup plan, so you just lost. There has been pretty much one exception to this rule. I mean, it's a deck way back when. I'm talking, it was called Baboon Burn, and it was built around a whole bunch of little beast monsters, but you could also summon Green Baboon, who was like a huge beater, so when your opponent took out all their battle traps, you'd get Baboon on field and be like, what now, motherfucker? But then you also had, you know, small pokes and burn damage, and this deck kind of works similarly to that. You know, if your opponent doesn't respect your 17 and 1900 beaters, well, then they have to respect the burn damage. And since you have so many ways of nuking boards in this deck, those little pokes can really add up. You know, there'd be one thing if you were just going to constantly wall, you were going to turtle, and you were going to set a whole bunch of monsters and say, okay, well, your Volcanic Rocket can't get over my Skarm, but guess what? When I have cards like Wildfire and Scattershot that can nuke boards, and I can do that, you know, every other turn, I don't really have to worry about running through your monsters. I can just blow them up, and then I can summon this guy, and these guys can just act as beaters. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is how this deck, very similarly to Heroes, isn't necessarily beholden to one element or one mechanic. You know, if you stop Stellar Knights and Burning Abyss from being able to Exceed Summon, you're probably going to win. If you stop Shadows from being able to Fusion Summon, you're probably going to win. If you stop Yang Zing from being able to Synchro Summon, you're probably going to win, because those are the things that the deck are completely built around. That's the thing that they want to do to get to their boss monsters, to get their power plays that make a ton of advantage. But when you look at this deck, I mean, there is no such thing as Fire Imprisoning Mirror. So there's no one blanket card that's going to stop all of these guys. They don't need to special summon at all, because Blaster and Doomfire are kind of just icing on the cake. By the way, let me just stop to say that I actually owe Doomfire an apology. I called this card I believe at different points one of the worst boss monsters ever, and it's actually not awful when I really looked at it. But again, I guess before this it pretty much was. Back to the points that I was making. I mean, you can't really attack the burn, because if you attack the burn, then I can still just constrict you and play the slow pace stun game, and you're probably not gonna win if you can't special summon. I don't really need the burn. It's just one of the things that help me win. So this deck can hit you from different angles, and I feel like it's really solid right now. It draws more cards than any deck in the entire game by a trillion miles. I mean, draw two, draw two, draw two by your turn. It's not even close. And I feel like this deck ironically committed a huge crime. There was supposed to be a fire-based deck that the Secrets of Eternity was built upon, and that is obviously Infernoids. And then you have this really old deck that came out forever ago. They get one card, and they're infinitely better than the newer deck, and they're also fire. I mean, is that irony or what? Because anybody should be able to understand that. Let me know what you guys think. The one thing that it can be a downside, I guess, to playing this deck is the deck does really rely on its removal, because outside of the disruption of the multiple Regekis, this and this, you know, the deck does kind of struggle against monster effects. So they do rely a lot on Fiendish Chain and Vanity's Emptiness. And also the one thing is, I don't necessarily think that I like your Klee matchup at all. I think that probably would be your worst matchup, because the things that you like to do in this deck, especially making sure your opponent can't special summon and going after monster effects, Klees really don't rely on a lot. In fact, they play cards like Skill Drain and Vanities themselves to kind of stop those things from happening altogether. And even though this deck does have monster destruction for days, see Regeki? See Regeki, see the fact that you can also play Regeki, it doesn't really have adequate back row removal, because that's just something that it doesn't really have like built into it. I mean, the deck doesn't really have any monster, or excuse me, back row destruction other than like Mystical Space Typhoon. And I guess this is like a halfway substitute back row counter, because I mean, if your opponent like sets a card in the back row, you can technically go after it, although you don't necessarily destroy it. And even the newer decks that have cards that act as monster destruction, cards like Fire Lake and Alpha Nova, they can be used as back row destruction as well. I actually think that if I had my choice, I'd probably give this deck like an Honest, a card that, you know, like gave a volcanic monster like 1500 attack during the damage step, because then even if you're, you know, your back row, your cards that you're using to protect you like this, and this, even if they were destroyed, then with all those cards that you're drawing, you still could draw into that Honest of Sorts card. Or if you didn't have that, then you could always fall back on potentially using Blaze Reload as a Regeki from the graveyard. So I feel like you'd have a failsafe and Scattershot, and then you have a failsafe to your failsafe in the Fire Honest type card. So maybe that'll be something that they get in the past, or they get in the future. But I guess the failsafe to, you know, your defense is always the fact that you can randomly kill your opponent with burn damage. See this card, see this card, see this card, see this card. Again, the deck has like burn damage for days. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, as always.